Hello, everyone, and welcome to the October webinar hosted by Project Trust. Today, we will be discussing the intersectionality of human trafficking and domestic violence through a complex trauma lens. We also have a few expert panelists who will be walking us through the topic and will provide us with some critical implementation steps to increase our understanding of how to implement this trauma-informed lens. This webinar is hosted by Project Trust. Project Trust is a national program focused on providing training and technical assistance to the human trafficking field through the Office of Victims of Crime. This program aims to support organizations across the country as they're working to integrate a trauma-informed approach to each level of service delivery and the overall organizational structure. Project Trust is a collaboration between the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI, the Sinar Institute, and Brandeis University's Institute on Assets and Social Policy. There are three goals that we hope to achieve through this webinar. The first is to identify where those intersections are between human trafficking and domestic violence. And by identifying these intersections, we can really start to break down those barriers to service provision for individuals who are impacted by these experiences. The second goal is to help you all implement a complex trauma lens to each part of service provision and delivery at every level of the organization. And by examining what trauma is and how it surfaces throughout the life course, we can then better understand how best to serve this demographic. And finally, the last goal is to understand how to implement those tools for a comprehensive trauma-informed best practices in direct service provision and to help increase that access to services. So just a few reminders before we get started on the content and before I introduce our panel of experts. When we hold these webinars, we really like to take a moment and remind everyone that our goals are to maintain a safe space. And we do that by allowing our colleagues to voice thoughts, their questions, concerns, and by helping to identify and help draw out the strengths that each of us brings to this training. So we always encourage, communicating with respect and openness and to participate in this discussion with an open mind because, that's really how we're going to pick up these new skills and make these great connections. And just in case anyone else has any other thoughts to make this a safe space, please feel free to use the chat box to ask to pose questions to your other colleagues or to add additional context for the things that we're talking about. And if you have any additional thoughts, please feel free to voice them. And the goal of this webinar is to make it as useful and as impactful as possible. So we really encourage you guys to join this conversation. And as we move through these topics, please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A features to reach out and ask questions to our panelists or use the chat feature to really connect with the audience a little bit more. We really are looking forward to hearing all of your insight that you're bringing to this training. And, as the panelists provide information, I'm going to do my best to answer questions in the chat box or in the Q&A section. However, there will be a brief Q&A at the end of the webinar. Now, I'd like to introduce our subject matter experts. My name is Naja Martin, and I'm here as a member of Project Trust. My role within Project Trust really focuses on providing comprehensive training and technical assistance to organizations striving to implement a trauma-informed lens to every level of their work, be it through case management services or through more high-level things like organizational wellness and trauma-informed care. Next, we have Becky Owens-Bullard, who is the Senior Director of Programs at the Metro Office of Family Safety in Nashville, Tennessee. We have Amy Shea, who is the Deputy Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families. And lastly, we have Kate Keisel, who is one of the founders and the Chief Executive Officer at the Sinar Institute. Before we move on, we're going to take a little bit of a moment to deploy a poll to really hear about who you guys are. So just take a moment, fill out this poll so that we can hear a little bit about you. Okay. We've got a lot of DV and human trafficking service providers on. Okay. That's great. We've got some legal providers joining us. Let's see here. Mental health providers, awesome. Okay, we've got a really diverse audience. I'm really excited to connect with you guys this afternoon. All right. Okay, great. Thank you guys for participating in that quick poll. Okay, and before we get started, I just wanted to provide a couple of self-care reminders as we move through this training. If you need to, feel free to step out for a moment, grab something to drink to stay hydrated, but also at the same time, do whatever you need to do to help you take in all of this information. We recognize that, that there may be some feelings that may come up during this training, and you may need some time to set aside debriefing for and processing all of this critical information. And finally, like I said, this information is pretty heavy. So be kind to yourselves and practice patience as you seek to implement these suggestions following the webinar. All right, now I'll turn it on over to Becky Owens-Bullard from the Metro Office of Family Safety to discuss the intersections of human trafficking and domestic violence.
Hello, everyone. My name is Becky Owens-Bullard, and I am the Senior Director of Programs at the Nashville Office of Family Safety, where I manage our city's response to high-risk interpersonal violence within our 2 family justice centers. I'm also a consultant for the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, where I train on leadership, collaboration, and on the intersections of human trafficking and domestic and sexual violence. I came to the anti-trafficking field over a decade ago after having worked for several years on the issues of domestic and sexual violence. And I actually worked with Kate many years ago at Polaris, where I was a regional coordinator on the National Human Trafficking Hotline and a national trainer. Since that time, I've trained on the intersections of human trafficking and domestic violence countless times. It's one of my favorite topics to speak about, especially now during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, because it can have such an important impact for our fields as well as for the clients that we serve. So thank you again to Project Trust and SONAR for having me present today with our panel of experts. All right, so before we dig into the intersections of these 2 crimes, I'd like to make sure everyone has an understanding of why we continue to see siloing between the domestic violence and human trafficking fields. This siloing is incredibly detrimental to victim identification and survivor healing. And the silo effect comes from many places and results in the idea that human trafficking and domestic violence are just different crimes. So we're going to explore a few of the myths and misconceptions that have created and perpetuate these ideas. One of the most directly harmful misconceptions that divides the issues of domestic violence and human trafficking is this idea that traffickers are always strangers to their victims. Normally, when I discuss this myth, I also show some imagery that's unfortunately really common in the anti-trafficking field that contains kind of exaggerated and sensationalized images of victims being bound, kidnapped, and forced into human trafficking. These images, and oftentimes even the language that's used in the anti-trafficking field, continues to spread the idea that traffickers are primarily strangers to their victims. So this is similar to what we saw in the sexual assault movement in the 80s and 90s, that oftentimes centered around the same idea of kind of stranger danger, and the idea that rapists were strangers waiting to assault women in dark corners. However, what we know now of sexual assault perpetrators is that they're often known to their victims and many times have already had an intimate relationship. The same goes for our now understanding of child abuse perpetrators who are also commonly known to their victims. So this quote shows how that misconception and the silos between domestic violence and human trafficking can be furthered even within our own fields. This quote is actually from a handbook for domestic violence providers around human trafficking victims. And the quote leads the reader to believe that traffickers are never individual actors and they don't have an intimate relationship with their victims, which is plainly false. We, of course, see individual traffickers constantly in both sex and labor trafficking, and we see those who have intimate relationships with their victims. So in reality, in the graph that we see here, it's in particular with sex trafficking, which is what this displays, is that intimate partners make up the majority of sex trafficking perpetrators. You see the second category is pimp, manager, agent, or boss. And then we see friends and family members next. And lastly are those in a category that were unknown or strangers in this particular study. So the stranger danger idea is also a misleading term when we're characterizing who make up the majority of traffickers. And it leaves out traffickers that are known or become known to their victims, the majority of which, as we see here, are intimate partners. Another harmful misconception is an idea that stems from the first misconception of stranger danger, that trafficking always involves organized crime and therefore very high lethality levels for victims. This is also perpetuated by images used to describe trafficking, movies made about trafficking, and news stories that are focusing on larger organized crime cases of trafficking. So while sex and labor trafficking can certainly involve organized crime, it's not always the case. And as evidenced by the previous slide, it's likely not a component in the majority of cases. So this quote shows the impact that this misconception can have. Again, this is from a guide for domestic violence providers around working with clients who've been trafficked. It mentions exceedingly high danger levels, not just one abuser, but many people with much to lose. By promoting this idea that traffickers cannot be intimate partners and are many people with much to lose, this guide is further otherizing human trafficking as something completely different from domestic violence. And it's also almost inciting fear in domestic violence providers that may want to incorporate human trafficking into their services. I can't tell you how many times we'd reach out to shelters on the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and it was as if they had all read this guide and had the immediate and understandable protective response for their other clients, that it was too much of a safety risk to allow a trafficking victim to stay in shelter. So the reality that we see is more often than not what was found from this USAID study that show that while oftentimes this is a rationale for not mixing domestic violence and human trafficking services, there isn't necessarily an empirical basis for that conclusion. It's based on those misconceptions and not necessarily based on reality, as attacks on shelters by traffickers are rare globally. So this is where it's important to think about risk. We need to evaluate each trafficker individually and not paint with a broad brush in the same way that we would do for clients who've experienced trafficking. We don't assume their needs or their wishes, and we shouldn't assume their safety risk or their trafficker's lethality. So risk assessments here are key. These are some of the factors that can be evaluated that we know from intimate partner violence research that can be incredibly lethal. So stalking behaviors, gang involvement, sexual violence, which is of course present in both sex and labor trafficking, access to firearms, and threats with a firearm are by far the highest risk indicator for abusers murdering their victims. Strangulation is also incredibly high, with increasing the risk for murder by 7.5 times. It's also very common in sex trafficking, with 54% of sex trafficking victims reporting that they experience strangulation. And then also threats to kill. All of these risk markers are things we should evaluate on a case-by-case basis. The final misconception I've seen silo these issues is the idea that because we've been taught with intimate partner violence that abusers are jealous, it's kind of one of those main red flags for someone who might be abusive. Because of this, we oftentimes assume they would not exploit their partner, especially for commercial sex. However, in reality, We also know that intimate partner abusers are often sexually violent, with 68% of people who've experienced intimate partner abuse reporting that they also experience sexual violence. And also, we see a lot of economic abuse, with 94% actually of individuals experiencing intimate partner violence reporting they experience economic abuse, and nearly 80% reporting economic exploitation. We also know that intimate partners often treat their victims as something they can control, own, and possess, or as their property. And then finally, intimate partner abusers often dehumanize their victims as well. So all of these traits, while we're thinking of the jealousy that kind of causes some confusion, all of these traits are very consistent with someone who could engage in sexual exploitation. So now let's look at the specific ways we can see the intersections manifest. So we often see domestic violence and human trafficking in these kind of separate spaces and siloed from each other, as we've mentioned. However, there are multiple similarities in these crimes. For example, in continuums of violence, where victims may experience multiple forms of domestic and sexual violence and child abuse before being trafficked. Also, in who the perpetrators themselves are, that an intimate partner can be both a domestic violence abuser and also a human trafficker. And then in how the perpetrator inflicts physical, sexual, psychological, and economic abuse on their victim. So these similarities can be seen in the power and control wheel that you see here. When I first came to the anti-trafficking field from the domestic and sexual violence fields, I went through a week-long training on human trafficking and I learned so much. But I also recognized many things I was familiar with from my work on domestic violence, specifically the way that power and control was utilized in labor and sex trafficking in non-physical forms, not always by this kind of kidnapping and overt force that I had seen in information on human trafficking at that time. There was subtlety and strategy. There was power and control like I'd seen abusers use skillfully. So I expected to see a power and control wheel because we have wheels for everything in other fields. And it never came. So at the end of my training, I asked my new supervisor if there was a human trafficking power and control wheel. And she said, no, you should make one. So I worked on the wheel with the Polaris Client Services team over a long amount of time, and we came up with this model. While it does include some of those physical forms of abuse, it covers the non-physical forms that are constant in both labor and sex trafficking. Things like using privilege, denying, minimizing, and blaming, isolation, and emotional abuse. These are all consistent with the rungs of the wheel that you see in intimate partner violence. And the intersections of power and control used by traffickers and abusers are essential to understanding the complexity of these crimes and the needs for the people who've experienced them. It's also important to remember the way we define these crimes are not incredibly distinct. Both are crimes against a person. Domestic violence is specifically related to intimate partners, family members, and cohabitants in most state statutes. And these parties are not excluded from being perpetrators of human trafficking. And in fact, as we've seen, they can commonly be perpetrators of trafficking. We also know that many traffickers, even if they're not family members or intimate partners, live or cohabitate with their victims. So that's a way they can fall into the definition of domestic violence. Force and coercion, of course, fall under each. Fraud tends to be more specific to anti-trafficking laws. And then action and means can certainly occur within each crime. So while purpose is what delineates human trafficking in this. And then now, who are traffickers? This is our kind of final way that we're looking at the intersections. How are domestic violence and human trafficking perpetrators intersecting? They can be one and the same. This is easier to understand sometimes when we look at this definition of who any human trafficker is, because the word trafficker leads to so many misconceptions. It's really no wonder that we are constantly having to dispel these myths and misconceptions about the crime itself. However, if we simply define a human trafficker as an abusive individual who's seeking to profit off of their abuse, it's much easier to see how intimate partner abusers can also be human traffickers in the same way child abusers, elder abusers, sexual abusers can as well. So in the short time that we have left, I wanted to show you a few examples of intimate partner trafficking. This billboard was something I saw after leaving the National Human Trafficking Hotline and moving to Denver, where I created the Denver Anti-Trafficking Alliance. On our very long drive there, I saw this billboard and thought that someone else was trying to raise awareness on intimate partner sex trafficking, like I'd been doing while at Polaris. And I was really excited. I wanted my husband to pull over the car, but he said that he saw the meth decal in the corner. My first thought was, would anyone looking at the billboard think what I did, that this is sex trafficking? Probably not. Would anyone look at the billboard and think this is domestic violence? Maybe. They might think this young man's abusing this young woman, but probably not. But would they think, wow, drugs make you do really terrible things? Most likely, which is of course the purpose of this campaign. So for me, this billboard speaks to hundreds of cases I've worked on that were just like this scenario. Some involved substance use, some did not, but very rarely were these cases seen as the, quote, typical trafficking case, which is concerning when we look at the majority of sex traffickers being identified as intimate partners. This creates a problem with how we identify these cases in both the domestic violence and human trafficking fields. As I mentioned before, we see continuums of violence where individuals are experiencing sex trafficking in particular, also in labor trafficking, where they've experienced child abuse, domestic violence before or even while being trafficked. But I also wanted to highlight with this slide that oftentimes the presenting victimization that clients come to our programs with, or that they interact with law enforcement about, is not often human trafficking. Typically what we see are clients who are disclosing previous child abuse experiences or current intimate partner violence, who they may later, after trust has been built, disclose sexual abuse and then later sex trafficking. The trust that needs to be present for these disclosures may take multiple sessions, and for law enforcement and prosecutors, multiple victim interviews or meetings to see the full picture. But of course, as Kate and Amy will talk about, disclosure here isn't the goal, support and empowerment is. This is a case study from our city's high-risk intimate partner violence case review team that we manage. Just last year on that team, we flagged nearly 80 cases from our reviews that had signs like this for trafficking. In this particular case, the intimate partner abuser, who was also a known gang member, had argued with the victim, who was the mother of his child, about another man in a hotel room. He'd taken her to another location against her will, and she was discovered only partly clothed by officers. So our team flagged this for sexual assault. I also suggested that we flag it for sex trafficking. And this was many years ago, before my team saw the intersections and said, oh, okay, Becky. But then she came to court a few days later. She met with detectives and an advocate, and she did disclose that she had been trafficked by her intimate partner and that he was threatening to take custody of the child away if she didn't do what he told her. So again, we see these cases all the time. And now we see them even more because we're actively looking for them. And this has happened enough time where our MDT really sees these intersections. Now with labor trafficking, while most of the data we have on the intersections looks at sex trafficking, labor trafficking also has direct intersections with domestic violence. Typically, we think of a labor trafficker as an employer or recruiter of some kind. However, in the same way we see various perpetrators in sex trafficking, we see that labor traffickers can be intimate partners, family members, friends who are forcing their victims to work or keeping them in situations of servitude. So again, I can't tell you how many times I would hear the words, "He treated me like a servant," when talking about abuse a survivor had experienced. However, when that survivor identified their perpetrator as an intimate partner or even a family member, the case always became fuzzier to service providers, investigators, and prosecutors about whether or not it was human trafficking. So let's look at this final case study where a woman and her children are forced to beg on the street by her husband. He transports them, sets a quota for what they must make, and abuses and monitors them to maintain control. This case is similar to many, many different cases I've worked on. This particular vignette is based off of a call I received again on the national hotline where law enforcement called in and said a similar story. It said that they had gotten the guy on every charge they could think of, but when contacting their anti-trafficking task force about trafficking charges, the response was, this is just domestic violence and couldn't be trafficking. So let's look at this case and replace the words husband and father with a controller or perpetrator without specifying their relationship. This case would undoubtedly be classified as human trafficking. Being someone's intimate partner doesn't all of a sudden make them immune from prosecution for forced labor and servitude. So finally, when we consider the high rates of economic abuse that I mentioned before, and the high rates of economic exploitation that people experience in abusive relationships, we have to ask the question, when does economic abuse and exploitation become human trafficking? It should not be dependent on the relationship between parties. And we need to look at how cases of intimate partner labor trafficking can be better identified as what they are, which is both domestic abuse and human trafficking. So the underlying theme of these intersections is that we need to consider this quote above, which is actually from a woman whose father trafficked her and her entire family and forced them to work on a family farm, that there's not just one type of trafficker. Traffickers are abusive people looking to profit off of that abuse. And many times those people are known to their victims as intimate partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you so much, Becky. All of that was incredibly useful information. Now we're going to go and hand it off to Kate Keisel from the Sinar Institute to discuss complex trauma over the life course and how violence affects the life course.
Thank you so much, Naja, and thank you, Becky. It's a tough act to come after so much information that I have just personally seen throughout the time that I've been fortunate enough to work in this field. As Naja mentioned, my name is Kate Keisel. I am the Chief Executive Officer at the Sinar Institute, which is a member of Project Trust. And I'm just really, really honored to be here today with such an amazing panel of co-presenters, but also with all of the participants here to share your wisdom as well. We always find that we learn so much from the individuals that come to these webinars as a collective movement and group that are looking to provide the best services to individuals possible. For myself, a little bit about me. I've been working in the anti-trafficking space for the past 12 years and in interpersonal violence and sexual violence for the duration of my career. At Sinar, my focus and our focus as an organization is specifically on building diverse pathways to healing from traumatic events. I work as a trauma therapist, a trainer, and I also integrate my own lived experience in healing from complex trauma in every aspect of what I do. It's really the heartbeat of the work and coming to it. At Sinar, we also work to provide long-term therapeutic evidence-based services to survivors of intimate partner violence, human trafficking, sexual violence, and other traumatic events with this really fundamental core belief that healing from trauma is a human right. We are also fortunate to support organizations locally and nationally through initiatives like Project Trust and globally so that we can build these trauma conscious and responsive practices that address the vulnerabilities that individuals have to future violence, but also really shift that narrative to prioritizing healing the wounds of trauma at both the individual, collective, and community level. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. Before we get started, I just want to recognize the heaviness of everything that we're talking about. And as someone who works every day and is incredibly passionate about what it means to move forward on our pathways to trauma, I just want to invite everyone to practice a mindfulness minute together before we move forward. And there are a couple parts to this, right? So we are going to be continuing for the last half of this time that we get to spend together in looking at the impacts of traumatic events, of the things that impacts our clients, potentially ourselves and others in our communities. And it's important to tune into how we're feeling in this very moment and throughout that. So as we go through this exercise, I invite you to just check in. take a moment, see how you're feeling, and bring both of your feet to the floor. And we're just going to take a deep breath for a tool called deep belly breathing. So we're going to breathe in through our nose and we're going to exhale deeply through our mouth. So let's go ahead and do one together. Breathing in and exhaling. I'm going to invite you to do 3 at your own pace. Breathing in, noticing anything in your body, releasing any tension, any stress, and exhaling. And just doing one more together, inhaling and exhaling. And just noticing how you feel in this moment, in this space, taking 15 seconds to check in, to ground ourselves, and to use some mindfulness in what we are doing and how we're coming to this moment. This is also one of those tools that we have in our toolkit when we're working with clients in our individual roles and thinking about how we support trauma responses. So for those of you that feel empowered, I would love if you would share in the chat box how you feel after just taking a moment to check in with yourself and take some really thorough, deep breaths. Now I'm going to invite us all to come to this next part of the presentation from a really basic human level, taking off our professional hats, taking off all of the things that we come into this training with, and really thinking at when we hear the word trauma, what comes to mind? And if each of you that feel comfortable doing this can share this in the chat box right now, what is it that comes up when we think of trauma? I've often heard pain, isolation, feeling alone, what it means to not know what's going to happen next. What are those other things for you at just a visceral level that come up when you hear trauma? Cassandra, thank you so much. Pain, absolutely. These are things that we have. Flashbacks from Lisa, hyper and hypoarousal, negativity and overwhelmness, victimization. All of these are things, feeling trapped. Thank you so much and keep them coming. And all of us can sort of read what comes up for us. So we are inundated about what trauma-informed care means, what it looks like, but I invite us to come back to the roots. And when we think about the word trauma itself, it is from the Greek origins of the word wound. And what do we know about physical wounds? What do we know about how they feel and how we need to take care of them? How do we know about how they heal? We know that they take time. We know that we oftentimes need external help or medical attention for these wounds to be really cared for in a way that's going to make sure it doesn't impact us later on in life. And when we think about this idea of seeking help for physical wounds, what do we think about people who do that? If in the middle of this presentation, I was to injure myself and say, I'm so sorry, I just had a serious physical injury, I'm going to need to go to the hospital, I'll get back and someone's going to take over. Would there be any stigma or thought around my own personal strength when I think about needing to seek medical attention for that physical wound? Usually the answer that when we all step back and think about it is no. Yes, thank you so much. We don't think about physical wounds as having that stigma around them, right? And so on that, when we think about how we perceive people's needs for psychological wounds, we know that they heal very similarly to those things as physical wounds. They need attention, they need evidence-based practices, they need support, but most importantly, we need to build a community and practices that make empowering based and courageous language synonymous with seeking support and getting the support that is right for each individual for the traumatic events that those people we work with and ourselves experience across the life course. And when we look at trauma, this isn't talking about other people, right? Trauma is a nearly universal experience. Almost all of us will experience a traumatic event across our life course. So when we think about that and we think about its prevalence, it's critical that we understand how trauma really impacts us on lots of different levels. But specifically today, in thinking about domestic violence and human trafficking, we want to think about what does it mean for our clients? What does it look like for this intersection? And often in our roles, we think about this as something that we're bearing witness to and putting into categories. And as Becky so brilliantly looked at, when we look at these intersections, we can see that there are so many things that overlap. But what is it that's overlapping? It's traumatic events. And so when we start to take a step back and we look at the traumatic events and the whole person, we can start to think about how we support individuals and how then those labeling and those intersections become really important critical pieces for opening service access. And that's what Amy is really going to focus on. But when we also think about traumatic events, they're incredibly individual. What is traumatic for me might not be for another person. How I experience that trauma is based on my own history and things that I've experienced in the past. So if we look at some of these things that are commonly reported for individuals who've experienced human trafficking and domestic violence, we can think about things like sexual violence, physical violence, but oftentimes we don't think about some of those other things that can be traumatic events. Let's take a look at just the example of withholding wages. That in and of itself, for someone that might be in a labor trafficking situation or in the commercial sex industry, of having wages withheld and not being able to support their family, might be considered more traumatic than a sexual assault that they experienced. That might not be, as a provider, what we look at as the most traumatic event, but we want to give autonomy for the people we're working with to define what is the most traumatic experience that they've had and support that in a way that really looks at that full person-centered perspective. So taking a step back and looking at language right now, this is something that is the nitty-gritty, right? When we think about trauma work, what are we talking about? When we start and we think about primary trauma, this is a traumatic event that we experience directly. Oftentimes in social justice fields, we talk about vicarious and secondary trauma. That would be something that we're witnessing, right? So a secondary piece. But when we talk about primary trauma, these are all of those traumatic events that we've experienced firsthand. So whether that's intimate partner, labor trafficking, whether that's a domestic violence situation or anything else on that spectrum, that is what we define as primary trauma. Then we have acute trauma, or what oftentimes in the clinical world is referred to as type 1 trauma. So this would be a single traumatic event that we experience directly. So this would be a car accident, a single incident of sexual violence. But when we look at human trafficking and domestic violence, what are we very often talking about? We're talking about complex trauma or type 2 trauma. And this is multiple incidents of physical, sexual, or psychological violence that's perpetrated by an individual or that is experienced by an individual across their life course. So when we're working with someone, we want to think about complex trauma histories and the different kinds of traumatic events that they may have experienced across their life course. Like Becky talked about, when we look at things in silos and we're just focusing on our human trafficking assessment or our domestic violence assessment, we may be missing other types of traumatic events that someone has experienced throughout their life course. So here is kind of a map of what does that look like from a practical level, right? So let's think about some case studies that we've seen at SINAR and maybe that you've seen in your agencies. I'd be curious if these resonate. Oftentimes what we are looking at is an entire history of violence across the life course, right? So this is an amalgamation of different cases that we have seen histories and patterns in with individuals that we've served within our organization. And very often what we see is a history in childhood of neglect, physical abuse, or sexual abuse, right? So we're starting very early on with experiences of unaddressed traumatic events. And then moving into early adolescence, maybe there's a sexual abuse by a family member that continues those different situations on the spectrum of violence. Moving into adolescence, then in later adolescence, dating violence, physical and sexual abuse, right? Then once we get into late adolescence, this is where oftentimes we've seen commercial sexual exploitation, things that would fit and qualify under severe forms of trafficking in persons and sex trafficking situations. So in this case, it was 19 to 22. Then exiting that situation, still not having addressed any of the trauma throughout the life course, an individual, as we know, is much more vulnerable to ongoing different kinds of violence across that life course. So this, in this particular situation, was intimate partner violence from age 22 to 30. And then when we move into later adulthood, Again, sexual violence. So this violence across the life course becomes the map of the individuals that we're serving. So when we cue in on one of these, because our organization focuses on this, we may miss all of these other traumatic experiences that have happened across someone's life course. And what happens then is we're not really able to respond to or support that whole person in their experiences. We also might make assumptions as to what is the most traumatic for an individual and focus on that. But very often what we see is what we assume might be the most traumatic is not what that person would identify. So again, making sure that we're asking questions to tell the whole story of someone's life course and not just focusing on the area in which we have the most experience, or maybe we're focused as an organization. And Amy, again, is going to talk about, by looking at ways that people have these diverse experiences, we may be able to open legal and service doors that would not have been there before for our clients. So when we look at violence across the life course and all of the traumatic events that we've experienced, we want to think about how that impacts us in the present, right? So that is not just about thinking about those events that took place in the past. And Bessel van der Kolk has an amazing quote that I think really embodies this, which is, trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the ongoing imprint left by that experience in the mind, brain, and body. So when we think about trauma, it is what happens in the present moment and how it changes the way that we think, we feel, we act, and even how our body physically responds. So when we look at trauma responses and when we think about trauma conscious work and building trauma informed frameworks, we want to be prepared to support individuals in understanding and managing those trauma related responses. So here are some common examples that we've seen when we look at those 4 different areas. So from emotions, right? The things that we're feeling, elevated levels of depression, anxiety, numbing, anger. So when we build tools and we pair those with things like that mindfulness minute that we did in that moment, when we sit with someone and we see that they're facing a lot of anxiety and intake, we can invite and bring in some relaxation skills to really ground in what's happening for that person in the moment and say, let's take a couple of deep breaths. Let's make sure we have some water available so that we can support what you're going through in this moment. Behaviors. Oftentimes when we're doing work in service provision, whether we're law enforcement or legal providers or social service providers, we may not understand why individuals who are exiting situations of either human trafficking and or domestic violence are displaying certain behaviors. Understanding them in the context of how trauma responses have kept us safe can help us understand situations where there might be aggression or isolation or reenactment, and help clients also understand these pieces. Contextualized in this way, when we look at substance misuse, for an example, as a coping mechanism for all of the different painful experiences that not just happened in that moment, but are coming up in our emotions and thoughts. These are a very different way to think about the work that we do and how we do assessments and the type of services that we pair individuals with on their journey. The cognitive piece, looking at individuals who are leaving these situations with a phenomenal amount of self-blame, shame, dissociation, flashbacks, a lot of these things that were mentioned when we think about trauma, right? It's the responses that we have to them in the present moment. And lastly, we focus a lot on physical because this is oftentimes what is deemed the safe place to talk about trauma. When I talk about not being able to sleep or having headaches or symptoms that are physical, there's less stigma. So we may start there and look at those physical responses and understand how they're tied to the trauma experiences of the past for individuals. So this is just a very quick appetizer of thinking about how trauma consciousness and understanding complex trauma really yokes together the person-centered aspect of doing services and service care and legal responses when we're thinking about domestic violence and human trafficking work. Lastly, I can't in good conscience to wrap up a part about trauma without highlighting that we all have the potential and the ability to heal. And that when we think about healing from trauma, when we get that right support, when we're able to process through those things that have happened, and we're able to support each individual as a full person for all of the events that they've experienced across their life course, we see that people don't just bounce back, but they bounce forward. That post-traumatic growth is real, and it can mean that there are pieces and parts of life that can be engaged, that joy and full self-actualization is attainable, and that we can support each and every person on their pathway to move towards healing. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it over to Naja to introduce Amy.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. That was really helpful in tying what Becky talked about together. And I think it's going to be great to move into Amy's portion, which is going to be discussing how to apply the trauma-informed best practices in direct service provision with human trafficking and domestic violence intersections. So Amy, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Naja. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. As Naja said, my name is Amy Shea. I am an attorney at Sanctuary for Families, and I've been there for the past 6 years. And I currently serve as the Deputy Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative, which is a team within our legal center that focuses on services for human trafficking survivors. And for those of you who are not familiar with Sanctuary, we're an organization based in New York City that started out primarily serving survivors of domestic violence. However, in learning about our clients' stories over the years, we came to understand that many were also survivors of human trafficking, and often at the hands of their intimate partners or others in their lives. And so today, Sanctuary provides shelter, clinical mental health services, economic empowerment services, and legal services, which include family law, immigration, housing, and public benefits related advocacy to our clients. And so we have this visual here to talk about service needs and eligibility, because truly when we meet with our clients, when all of you meet with your clients, they're usually coming to us, not telling us specifically, like, I fit this kind of, victimization or survivorship, or telling us kind of which legal or service kind of definition that they meet in, they fit into, and they shouldn't have to. Generally, they're coming to us for help with a background story of what happened and possibly an immediate need, such as housing or safety or immigration. But survivors of trauma may benefit from an array of services that your agencies may be able to offer, ranging from housing to legal and many others. And so I really wanted to take the moment to kind of think about what Kate mentioned, which is our goal is always to support the entire person and not the labeled victimization. And so while we are here today talking about the intersections of domestic violence and human trafficking and trying to come up with kind of these categories, at the same time, we're also trying to think about the whole person. And ultimately, it's my role to identify as many areas and services that my clients would be eligible for and present them with options. In identifying intersectionality for service access, we're the ones who have to kind of hear the client stories and kind of think about what various services they might be eligible for. As agencies, our services are often available through government-funded programs or other kinds of funding that specifies the type of population we can serve or who qualifies for our services. So, for example, Sanctuary is an OVC-funded grantee, and so we're looking for, we're able to serve individuals who meet the federal definition of trafficking, a person who is a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. Or as an OVS funded grantee. So in New York State, OVS is an agency that provides funding for serving crime victims. And so as a domestic violence and gender violence organization, we're looking to serve individuals who meet both a crime victim definition and also a survivor of gender violence definition. But again, our clients are not coming to us saying, I meet this federal grant definition or this state grant definition, and they're coming to us with a story. And whether it's in our roles as an attorney, a counselor, or social worker, or any other role that we play, our goal is to assess and identify that they meet, one of these definitions. And once we're able to identify that, then we can determine how additional services might be available to them. Organizations that keep in mind that entire spectrum of potential victimization, polyvictimization, can actually open more service doors and resources that wouldn't have otherwise been available. So in order to identify eligibility, we need to have a fuller understanding of what our clients experienced. And this really goes back to what Becky and Kate have talked about in relation to the various forms of trauma that our clients have experienced. Potentially they're coming to you with one main incident and experience, and potentially they're coming to you with many different experiences over the course of their life. So in our agency, we train all of our new staff and volunteers on the impact of trauma on our clients' abilities to tell their story to us, as well as the impact of our hearing those stories. We prepare our team with trauma-informed techniques to support our survivor clients. And so we think about grounding techniques that can help our clients to return to the conversation if they're triggered by a particular area that we're asking questions about. We come prepared with water, and these are just some kind of very basic ones, but I'm sure SINAR has offered many other trainings on various ways to incorporate trauma-informed techniques in interviewing. But just as an example, when I'm meeting with a client, let's say, who has been identified after an arrest for prostitution and is potentially a human trafficking victim, when I'm meeting with them, I don't start off just by talking about what happened with your arrest. Like, how did you get arrested? Tell me that very traumatic moment. And potentially that individual, yes, experienced that and potentially had also experienced human trafficking and many other forms of trauma. But what I'm trying to hear in terms of trying to identify human trafficking or domestic violence or any other kind of victimization, I don't need to kind of jump in right away with the thing that could be the most traumatic for them. And so kind of when I approach the conversation, I really try to get to understand the person and their whole life first. I know that that's not always feasible timing wise for you all to have a drawn out long conversation, but I think at a minimum to not start out with the thing that we suspect is happening. So it's, and as Kate mentioned earlier, different traumatic events affect individuals differently. And so while we might think the human trafficking is the worst thing and that being arrested potentially was a good thing because that helped them to be identified, oftentimes our clients are not sharing that experience or understanding. And so we try to be very mindful of that. And so for that reason, we really do need to practice patience. We need to be ready to have multiple meetings before we can determine what the best plan of action is, or even if a person is definitively a survivor of one form of trauma or violence over another. And it really does take time to build trust and assess for intersectionality. We often are the first people our clients are encountering and who have sat down with them to really listen to their entire story. Or we might be many people down the line to have heard their story, but ultimately our goal is to determine if we can help that individual before us get on the other side of this, to provide services that can help them overcome whatever is maybe their immediate need or even kind of broader needs that they have in mind. So I wanted to share a couple of case examples just for your consideration. So these different services are highlighted here. These are different services that are available at Sanctuary. But being housed within the legal center, I'm often meeting people who are coming to us with legal needs first. So I'll talk about the case of Mina, which is a pseudonym. She was referred to Sanctuary through New York's Human Trafficking Intervention Court, which means she had been arrested for prostitution, where she was identified at an illicit massage business. And so when I was meeting with her first, we identified that she had been coerced to provide sexual services. And so for me, it became clear that we could potentially help her to get immigration status as an undocumented individual who experienced trafficking. But also through multiple later meetings, we also learned that her intimate partner was one of the main driving forces behind the reason why she continued to work at that illicit massage business. And so we were able to support her to report to law enforcement and help her to get an order of, well, actually, I should add that in addition to being coerced into providing sexual services, she was also, shared a child in common with her intimate partner, and he was continuing to abuse her and her daughter when she refused to continue to work in the illicit massage businesses. And so we supported her to report her victimization to law enforcement. They were able to get her an order of protection and also concurrently help to meet a requirement for applying for T non-immigrant status, which is to demonstrate that she was cooperating with reasonable requests from law enforcement to investigate the trafficking. And I think to one of the questions from the chat earlier about how law enforcement is being trained or not on this issue. So I think the experience is varied depending on the agency. So when we're seeking immigration relief for Mina, we were actually requested to provide more information because in our presentation of the facts to them, they saw it as Mina voluntarily going to work at this illicit massage business providing sexual services. And unfortunately, she is also a victim of intimate partner violence. But they weren't seeing the connection between her trafficker, her intimate partner, basically putting her in that position for the purposes of gaining, profiting off of her working at this massage business. And so we did have to do a fair amount of education in our response to this agency. And so in terms of returning to Mina's other service access, we're able to also help to prevent her from getting evicted from her home. After she had separated from her intimate partner, she was in not in shelter, but she stayed in a separate apartment, and we were able to advocate against her from being evicted. And we're also able to access particular funds that are available to both DV survivors and human trafficking survivors. So I think that was just one example of increasing service access by identifying victimization in both. I did want to highlight just one other quick one example. So another way that Sanctuary is kind of hopefully trying to broaden our ability to connect with individuals is that we have a partnership with a hospital system in New York, the Health and Hospital Center, and we have a collaborative called the Empower Center, where we're providing all of these services coming in through the health ones. And one client that came to us through the human trafficking hotline identified herself as a trafficking survivor or a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation at first. But at present, we know that she's actually still in a relationship with someone who is potentially a former buyer and is continuing to abuse her. And so by realizing that she's both a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation and DV, we're able to help to try to find DV-based housing options for her. And so since I am short on time, I did just want to talk about ultimately the goal, what is the goal of all of this? It's not to label our clients as one type of victim over another. Really, we are trying to support the full person to move forward, to bounce forward, to use Kate's words. And by expanding our understanding of our clients' experiences, we're really able to offer a broader range of services to suit their needs in a more holistic way. And so with that, I will turn it back to Naja and to everyone for potential questions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. To those of you who have to hop off now because we're at time, please feel free to do so. However, Kate, Becky, and I will be sticking around after we go through the next couple of slides for participant Q&A. I did send a message to everybody just saying if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom and we will get to those questions. Okay? All right. So first, I just wanted to let everybody know that there are going to be a couple of additional resources and events that are coming up that may be of interest. The first is a peer call with Project Trust on the outreach toolkit that we've developed. The peer call will be on Thursday, November 12th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the conversation will be focused on implementing outreach strategies during Human Trafficking Awareness Month. The next upcoming conversation is going to be a cross-cultural conversation, which will sort of be like a part 2 from today. And during this peer call, we will have 5 service providers from across the country, and they will provide their own experiences implementing a trauma-informed response to their work. And these panelists will be from a multidisciplinary background, from case management to organizational leadership. And we would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this webinar, we'd also like to invite you to participate in the research interviews with Project Trust through our research partners at Brandeis University. We're particularly interested in your experience, regardless of what kind of stakeholder you are, law enforcement or case management or what have you, supporting individuals with lived experiences. And you can reach out to Resham Sethi to schedule your interview by shooting her an email. And if you have any additional questions for any of the panelists, or if you want a little bit more one-on-one interaction with any of them, feel free to follow up via email. And if you're interested in training and technical assistance from Project Trust, you can submit a request via our website at projecttrust.org or via our email at projecttrust@uscri.mail.org. And please look out for an email following this webinar with the registration for these upcoming events, as well as with a follow-up resources that we discussed today. And so now we're just going to go ahead and switch it over to Q&A. If anyone has any questions, we'll stick around for just a couple